Have you ever watched someone push away the very thing they desperately want, like a person dying of thirst who refuses water because they fear it might be poisoned? This puzzling behavior sits at the heart of understanding how avoidants turn rejection into a survival strategy, and the psychological mechanisms behind it are far more sophisticated than most people realize. Picture someone who has learned to treat love like a dangerous game where getting close means getting hurt. These individuals have developed what appears to be an almost supernatural ability to sense rejection before it happens, and then they do something remarkable yet tragic. They reject first. It's like watching Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl orchestrate elaborate schemes to maintain control. Except instead of social status, avoidants are protecting their hearts with the same calculated precision. The human brain is remarkably efficient at learning patterns, especially when survival feels threatened. For avoidants, rejection isn't just an emotional experience, it becomes a roadmap for navigating future relationships. Every dismissal, every time someone walked away, every moment they felt abandoned gets filed away in their mental database as evidence. This evidence then shapes how they approach new connections, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that would make even the most paranoid conspiracy theorist proud. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. The very strategies that once protected them as children, emotional distance, self-reliance, the ability to shut down feelings, become the prison walls of their adult relationships. What started as a brilliant survival mechanism transforms into something that actively works against their deepest desires for connection and love. Throughout this exploration, you'll discover the hidden cognitive biases that fuel this cycle, understand the stories avoidants tell themselves to justify their behavior, and most importantly, learn practical strategies for breaking free from this pattern. Whether you recognize these patterns in yourself or someone you love, understanding how rejection becomes a survival strategy is the first key to unlocking healthier, more fulfilling relationships. The science behind attachment styles reveals truths that can literally change lives, but only if we're brave enough to face them. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Now, let's dive into a story that illustrates exactly how this transformation happens. Meet Sarah, a marketing executive who seemed to have everything figured out on the surface, much like Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris. Confident, successful, and apparently unbothered by romantic complications. But beneath that polished exterior lay a complex web of protective mechanisms that had been decades in the making. Sarah's story began in childhood, as these stories often do. Her parents weren't cruel or obviously neglectful. They were simply busy, distracted, emotionally unavailable in that subtle way that creates the deepest wounds. When 8-year-old Sarah would approach her mother for comfort after a bad day at school, she'd often hear, "Not now, sweetheart, mommy's working." When she tried to share excitement about a drawing or a good grade with her father, he'd give her that absent-minded pat on the head while scrolling through his phone. Each of these moments taught Sarah something profound about human connection. People leave. People are unreliable. Getting your hopes up only leads to disappointment. By the time she reached adolescence, Sarah had unconsciously developed a sophisticated early warning system for rejection. She could sense when someone was losing interest before they probably knew it themselves. But here's where Sarah's brain made a crucial adaptation that would define her adult relationships. Instead of waiting for the inevitable disappointment, she learned to strike first. If she sensed her high school boyfriend pulling away, she'd become suddenly critical of his clothes, his friends, his dreams. If a close friend seemed to be drifting toward other social circles, Sarah would find reasons to be unavailable when that friend reached out. Fast forward to Sarah's adult dating life, and this pattern had evolved into something almost artistic in its precision. She had an uncanny ability to find flaws in otherwise wonderful partners. Too attentive became clingy. Too independent became not interested enough. Like Joe Goldberg from Netflix's You series, she became a master at analyzing behavior and predicting outcomes. Except instead of obsessing over someone, she was finding reasons to dismiss them. The tragedy of Sarah's situation wasn't that she couldn't find love. Opportunities presented themselves regularly. The tragedy was that her survival strategy had become so automatic, so deeply ingrained, that she couldn't recognize when genuine connection was right in front of her. Her brain had become like a security system that was so sensitive it triggered false alarms constantly, protecting her from threats that didn't actually exist. But Sarah's story takes an interesting turn when she meets David, someone whose patience and consistency began to challenge every assumption she'd made about human nature. David didn't play games. When Sarah would pull away, he'd give her space without disappearing entirely. When she'd find fault with him, he'd listen thoughtfully instead of getting defensive or retaliating. For the first time in years, Sarah's rejection strategies weren't working the way they always had. This created a crisis for Sarah's nervous system. Her go-to survival strategies were failing, and she found herself in uncharted territory. The very thing she'd spent decades avoiding, vulnerability in a relationship, was becoming unavoidable if she wanted to keep David in her life. But what Sarah didn't realize yet was that this crisis would become the catalyst for the most important transformation of her adult life. The question that kept Sarah awake at night became the same question that haunts many avoidants when they encounter genuine love. How do you learn to trust when your entire emotional operating system is designed around the assumption that trust leads to pain? How do you dismantle defenses that have protected you for so long, even when you intellectually understand they're now hurting more than helping? Sarah's journey toward answering these questions reveals everything we need to know about how rejection becomes a survival strategy and, more importantly, how that strategy can evolve into something healthier. But before we explore the solutions, we need to understand the cognitive machinery that keeps this cycle running so efficiently. The human brain operates on what psychologists call the negativity bias, our natural tendency to give more weight to negative experiences than positive ones. For avoidance, this bias becomes supercharged. One rejection can erase the memory of 10 positive interactions. One criticism can overshadow weeks of compliments and affection. This isn't weakness or oversensitivity, it's a survival mechanism that was once essential but has outlived its usefulness. Confirmation bias also plays a starring role in the avoidance mental theater. Once someone believes that people are unreliable and relationships end in pain, their brain becomes incredibly efficient at noticing evidence that supports this belief while filtering out contradictory information. When David showed up consistently for Sarah, her brain didn't interpret this as evidence of his reliability. Instead, it looked for signs of when the other shoe would drop. Perhaps the most insidious cognitive bias affecting avoidance is something called the fundamental attribution error. When someone hurts them, avoidants assume it reveals something permanent about that person's character. When someone treats them well, they assume it's due to temporary circumstances. This creates a worldview where negative treatment feels predictable and eternal, while positive treatment feels fragile and temporary. But here's what makes avoidance truly fascinating from a psychological perspective. These aren't random cognitive errors or personal failings. These are sophisticated adaptations that served a purpose. The child who learned not to depend on inconsistent caregivers developed strategies that protected them from repeated disappointment. The problem is that these same strategies can prevent adults from recognizing and accepting genuine love when it appears. Understanding this cognitive architecture is the first step toward changing it, but knowledge alone isn't enough. The real transformation happens when avoidants like Sarah begin to challenge these automatic thought patterns with the same intelligence and determination they once used to build their defenses. The question becomes, how do you rewire decades of conditioning without losing the strength and independence that helped you survive? Now that you understand how rejection becomes a survival strategy, let's talk about what you can actually do about it. Whether you recognize these patterns in yourself or someone you care about, change is absolutely possible, but it requires a specific approach that honors both the wisdom of these protective strategies and the desire for deeper connection. The first step involves developing what therapists call emotional awareness without judgment. This means learning to notice your automatic reactions to potential rejection without immediately acting on them. When you feel that familiar urge to pull away or find fault with someone who's getting close, pause. Don't judge yourself for having these feelings. They've kept you safe for years. Instead, get curious about what specifically triggered your defensive response. Was it something they said, a tone of voice, the fact that you were starting to care about their opinion? This pause creates space between feeling and reaction, and that space is where transformation happens. Think of it like being a scientist studying your own emotional responses. When Serena van der Woodsen from Gossip Girl would dramatically flee situations that made her feel vulnerable, she was acting on pure impulse. You're going to learn to observe those impulses with the same detached interest you might have watching a nature documentary. The second crucial step is learning to separate past experiences from present reality. Your brain has been running pattern-matching software for years, constantly scanning new relationships for signs of familiar dangers. But here's what that software doesn't account for. Not everyone is like the people who hurt you before. This seems obvious intellectually, but emotionally, it's revolutionary. Start small with this practice. When you notice yourself making assumptions about someone's motives or predicting how they'll disappoint you, ask yourself, what evidence do I have that this specific person, in this specific situation, will behave the way I'm expecting? Often you'll discover that your predictions are based more on past experiences than present facts. This doesn't mean becoming naive or ignoring red flags. It means becoming more accurate in your assessments. The third step is perhaps the most challenging, but also the most liberating, learning to communicate your fears instead of acting them out. Avoidants are masters at indirect communication. Instead of saying, "I'm scared you're going to lose interest in me," they'll become critical or distant. Instead of admitting, "I care about you and that makes me feel vulnerable," they'll find reasons why the relationship won't work long term. Direct communication feels terrifying because it removes your escape routes. When you tell someone exactly what you're afraid of, you can't pretend later that you didn't care if your fears come true. But here's what's remarkable about this kind of honesty. It often prevents the very outcomes you're afraid of. When you tell someone, "I have a tendency to pull away when I start caring about someone, and I'm noticing that urge right now," most secure partners will respond with understanding rather than rejection. The fourth step involves retraining your brain to notice positive evidence with the same intensity you notice negative evidence. This requires deliberate practice because it goes against your natural negativity bias. Start keeping a mental or written record of times when people show up for you, keep their promises, or demonstrate care through their actions. When someone texts back promptly, when they remember something important you told them, when they make time for you in their schedule. These data points matter just as much as any negative experience. This isn't about becoming artificially positive or ignoring real problems. It's about giving positive evidence the same weight you give negative evidence. Love Goldberg from Netflix's You obsessively catalogued information about the objects of his fascination, but he filtered everything through his own narrative. You're going to catalog information too, but with the goal of seeing reality more clearly rather than confirming pre-existing beliefs. The fifth step is learning to tolerate the discomfort of uncertainty without jumping to negative conclusions. Avoidants often prefer knowing that something will end badly to not knowing how it will end at all. Uncertainty feels dangerous because it means you can't prepare your defenses. But healthy relationships require accepting that you cannot control or predict another person's feelings and choices. Practice sitting with uncertainty in small doses. When someone doesn't text back immediately, instead of assuming they're losing interest, try thinking, "I don't know why they haven't responded yet," and that's okay. When someone seems quieter than usual, instead of preparing for rejection, try, "They might be having a hard day," or maybe they're just tired. This tolerance for uncertainty is like building a muscle. It gets stronger with practice. The sixth and perhaps most important step is learning to see your avoidant patterns as information rather than identity. You are not broken or fundamentally flawed because you developed these protective strategies. You are someone who learned to survive in circumstances that required emotional self-protection. Those skills served you well, and now you're simply expanding your repertoire to include strategies for thriving in healthier relationships. When you catch yourself falling into old patterns, respond with the same compassion you'd show a friend who was struggling. Instead of, "I always sabotage good relationships," try, "I'm noticing my old protective patterns showing up," which makes sense given what I've learned about relationships in the past. This shift from self-criticism to self-compassion is crucial because shame keeps avoidant patterns locked in place. When you judge yourself harshly for having these tendencies, you create more emotional danger, which triggers more avoidant behavior. When you respond to yourself with understanding, you create the emotional safety needed for new patterns to emerge. The final step involves gradually increasing your tolerance for emotional intimacy. This means sharing more of your inner world with trusted people, asking for support when you need it, and allowing others to care for you in ways that feel meaningful to them. Start with small vulnerabilities and work your way up. Share a worry, ask for advice, admit when you're struggling with something. Remember that intimacy isn't just about romantic relationships. Practice these skills with friends, family members, even colleagues when appropriate. The goal is to prove to your nervous system that emotional openness can be safe, but this proof needs to come through repeated positive experiences rather than just logical understanding. Sarah's story, which we began earlier, illustrates how this process works in real life. When she met David, her initial impulse was to find reasons why he wouldn't work out long-term. But instead of acting on these impulses immediately, she started getting curious about them. She noticed that her criticism of David intensified whenever he did something particularly thoughtful or caring. This awareness helped her realize that kindness was actually one of her triggers for rejection fears. Instead of pushing David away through criticism, Sarah took the unprecedented step of telling him directly about her fears. She explained that she had a history of relationships ending badly and that his consistency was both wonderful and terrifying for her. David's response surprised her. Instead of running away from her baggage, he appreciated her honesty and shared some of his own relationship fears. This experience of vulnerability leading to closeness rather than rejection became a turning point for Sarah. It didn't cure her avoidant tendencies overnight, but it planted a seed of evidence that contradicted her deepest beliefs about human connection. Over time, as she continued practicing these new approaches, Sarah discovered that love didn't have to be a dangerous game of anticipating rejection. It could be a collaborative process of two people learning to create safety and trust together. As we reach the end of this exploration, it's important to remember that understanding how avoidants turn rejection into a survival strategy isn't just an intellectual exercise. This knowledge has the power to transform lives, relationships, and the entire trajectory of how someone experiences love and connection. The journey from using rejection as a survival strategy to embracing authentic intimacy is not a linear path. There will be setbacks, moments when old patterns feel more comfortable than new ones, times when the fear of vulnerability seems overwhelming. This is normal and expected. Growth happens in spirals, not straight lines, and every time you catch yourself falling back into protective patterns, you're actually demonstrating increased self-awareness. What makes this transformation possible is understanding that avoidant attachment patterns developed for good reasons. The child who learned not to depend on unreliable caregivers was being smart, not damaged. The teenager who developed strategies for emotional self-protection was adapting to their environment, not choosing to be difficult. The adult who struggles with intimacy is dealing with the natural consequences of these early adaptations, not suffering from some fundamental character flaw. This perspective shift from pathology to adaptation is crucial because it allows for change without shame. When you understand that your protective strategies made perfect sense given your experiences, you can honor their wisdom while also recognizing that they may no longer serve your current goals and desires. The cognitive biases we discussed, negativity bias, confirmation bias, fundamental attribution error, are not personal failings, but universal human tendencies that become amplified in people who learned early that relationships are dangerous. Understanding these biases gives you power over them. When you can recognize that your brain is filtering information through these lenses, you can start to actively look for evidence that contradicts your assumptions. Remember that secure attachment isn't about never feeling fear or uncertainty in relationships. Even the most securely attached people experience moments of doubt, worry about rejection, and struggle with vulnerability. The difference is that secure individuals have learned to communicate these fears rather than act them out, to seek reassurance when needed rather than create distance, and to give positive evidence equal weight with negative evidence. The practical steps we outlined, developing emotional awareness, separating past from present, communicating directly, noticing positive evidence, tolerating uncertainty, practicing self-compassion, and gradually increasing intimacy, are not just techniques, but a complete retraining of your emotional operating system. This process requires patience with yourself and often benefits from professional support, especially when working through deep-seated patterns that developed in childhood. For those who recognize avoidant patterns in someone they love, understanding these mechanisms can transform frustrating relationship dynamics into opportunities for compassion and growth. When you realize that someone's tendency to pull away or find fault isn't about you but about their learned survival strategies, you can respond with patience rather than taking their behavior personally. The most profound truth about avoidant attachment is that the very people who seem most independent and self-sufficient are often the ones who long most deeply for genuine connection. Their strategies for avoiding rejection mask a tremendous capacity for love and loyalty. When avoidants feel truly safe in a relationship, they often become some of the most devoted.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.